everyone. I'm Grace. I first would like to say thank you to Dr. Julie Exline. I am so grateful for your exploration of anger. And the first thought is if anger is an indicator of injustice done to self or someone you care about or a group of people you care about, I wonder how we can continue to deepen the exploration of anger in clinical settings, in healing spaces, with new understandings of anger and spiritual struggles. And thank you to Dr. Jacqueline Williams on Zoom. I just admire chaplains. The work you do is incredible. And whenever I think of chaplains, I think of the image of Jesus just reaching out to grab Peter from the waters. I'm so thankful for how you model your embodied presence. Yeah. So the way I would like to structure my student response is to provide my personal lens, my current context, and some questions I have. So let's start with my personal context. I'm from Malaysia, but I lived in Beijing from 2008 to 2013, New York from 2013 to 2018, and then Hong Kong from 2018 to 2021, and finally I am here, right? So growing up for the first 13 years of my life in Malaysia, spirituality isn't a singular topic that we incorporate. It's normal, regardless of religiosity. There simply is this environmental sense that there is a reality beyond what we can see. And to deny that is to be naive. I grew up at haunted toilet stories in my elementary school. Frequent stories of unexplainable healings through spiritual means like exorcism or this thing called bomos, which is a Muslim shaman, or just rituals in general. And my American boyfriend pointed out when he visited Malaysia this past winter, you would never see a mosque, a Hindu temple, a Christian church, a Buddhist temple, a Catholic church all on one street in America. But you would see that in Malaysia, everywhere. So even if you don't believe in God or a higher power per se, you would still visit the gravesites of your ancestors. You would burn incense daily for the prosperity of your business. So for the majority in Malaysia, there is a tether to another world beyond this reality. So for my church in Malaysia, that was technically Methodist, but very charismatic in practice, spiritual warfare classes were the norm. And tongues were like our fourth or fifth languages because we are multilingual. And I remember vividly at the age of 12, I and the rest of us in the youth program, we went through a session of learning how to speak in tongues. And by the end of the hour, somehow we were all able to speak in tongues. I grew up seeing people who were once possessed become free, insane become sane, ostracized become integrated. I grew up witnessing deliverance. And these deliverers were people whose characters matched their faith. So these kind of miracles paired with adult figures who were congruent in faith and virtue are the foundations of my faith throughout my childhood. But I do want to spend just a moment to point out that not this sentiment of spiritual warfare is triggering to some, especially those who were victims of abusers, who use spiritual warfare as a tool of manipulation. It is important to acknowledge that not all who use spirituality are good or have good intentions. So then after that, I moved to Beijing in 2008 at the age of 13. On top of puberty and overall life adjustments, one of the struggles I encountered was the church we attended in Beijing. As internationals, we could attend the international church by showing our foreign documents at the door. But because at that time there is only one international church to cater to all the internationals in Beijing, the church was effectively non-denominational and as palatable as possible, using their words. I found it weird as a 13-year-old that tongues were not allowed, and that in general, there's just no demon possessions in China. Right? The China I had was one of Orientalist tropes from TV shows that were rooted in Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and these were mostly created by Chinese immigrants who left before or around 1949. But the China I entered in 2008 was one that was marred by the Cultural Revolution that eradicated traditions and religions, leading to a spiritual desert that science, politics, and secularization sought to fill. So you would think that the same sensations I felt in China, those same ones or the same, like, I'm thinking about my time in America, basically. And I find it funny that the same feelings I feel in China are the same ones I feel here. And you would think, this is a Christian nation. And I acknowledge that I lived in New York and now I'm in Pasadena. These are two very secular places. And maybe the Midwest or the Bible Belt might feel really different. But I want to provide the contrast of Malaysia and Beijing, two places I lived in before the age of 18, to show where my spiritual intuition is when I am where I currently am. And to take a moment to think about my own biases towards secularized places, I'm reminded of a moment I shared with a friend of mine who is second-generation Colombian, born and raised in America. One day, out of the blue, he just asked me if I believed in demons and them having influence over humans. And I was like, definitely in Asia, but not in America. And my rationale for that answer was I just know how spiritually unalive I feel in America, but also the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis. Knowing how Wormwood sometimes just didn't need to do much because his human was already so caught up in work and technology and human relationships. Wormwood was like, I don't need to do anything. Let the world do its thing, But then my friend responds, as a kid in America, he was visited by demons in his dreams. He vividly describes the images. He then says he stopped experiencing them ever since he grew out of childhood. Then he said his mother had also experienced it, and also his family members in Colombia. So I'm not just wrestling with this desert feeling that I have of being in America in a context that does not speak of the spiritual as normal. And I'm not even talking about spirit like crystals, Ouija boards, or like sound baths. I'm talking about positioning of self in relation to the world. And I also am holding and wondering how much of our spirituality is generational beyond environments, and perhaps embedded into our DNA, our blood, because of curses that span generations. So now my current context. I'm training to be a marriage and family therapist. My current practicum site is right up the stairs, full of psychological and family services, great therapists. I love it there. And one of the reasons I came to Fuller is if I wanted to help people heal as a therapist, I wanted to come to a place that would actively integrate my spiritual ideas of healing. And I knew that in pursuing this career path, my faith could not be an add-on. It needed to be fully integrated and reckoned with. And so I'm so grateful to have my first experiences at FPFS as a therapist in training where the majority of my clients are spiritual/religious. It's so fascinating to see how their relationship with God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and the church affects and reflects their current dysfunction or journey towards healing. And even for those that aren't explicitly religious, there is something otherworldly about experiencing safety and healing in a vulnerable, intimate relationship. And so whether or not a client experiences spiritual struggles, the Christian in me cannot help but spiritualize the struggle. And obviously not in a way that imposes theology or is coercive to go where the client doesn't want to go. What I mean is that if I neglect God's purposes and the Holy Spirit in the clinical space, I'm effectively ignoring not only a large part of who I am and what makes me unique as a clinician, but also possibly missing parts of my clients that need to be seen in a sterilized, secularized healing space. When I'm sitting in a room with a client who is struggling to win against suicide, there is something else working against me and my client other than a DSM-5 depression diagnosis. When I'm walking with a client through the patterns they see in themselves from their family of origin, I cannot help but think about how my role and the client's experience mirrors the first words from God about himself in Exodus 34, verses 6-7. The Lord passed in front of Moses, calling out, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but I do not excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations. It is so humbling to know that I get to be a small reflection of God's compassion, forgiveness, and love as a therapist. But it's so sobering to be reminded that the consequences of sin are intergenerational trauma, deep sickness, relational brokenness. So my framework in entering the symposium was to continue putting pressure on the tension between the spiritual and the clinical. I am still reconstructing my theological grounding as a Christian and building up my conceptual home base as a clinician, but I'm a huge fan of the new wave of activism that advocates for reconnection with nature, with self, with traditions, liturgies, hymns, with the old that wasn't actually bad because it's not new, you know? And just because the spiritual is not necessarily scientific or rational or new, allowing the ambiguity and flexibility of spirituality can still be valid and true in supporting the healing process. And spirituality can manifest in so many ways if we allow ourselves to see it, through a client's growing ability to be comfortable with the unknown, and increased awareness of spiritual attributions that leads to a more positive mindset like karma or blessings, a shifting posture towards forgiveness of self and others that heals generations of unspoken pains and hurts. I believe the Spirit is always moving, and it is my hope that our sails stay open, wide open to his winds, even when the clinical space has been canonically been sanitized and secularized. So this leads to my questions. The first one is, what should be the relationship between clinical intuition and the whispers of the Holy Spirit? My current approach in therapy is very much the here and now, the relationship between me and the client, what I feel informs the work. And I'm always interested in honing my clinical instinct. And that approach does parallel my faith and my faith that's more spirit-led and how I said I want to hone my instincts. But there's so many pitfalls and margins when you're relying on gut instinct or the Holy Spirit. So I'm just wondering if anyone wants to talk about just the balancing between the two, when to listen to one or the other, or if they're the same, and the muddiness between the two concepts. The second question I have is the role of language in spiritual struggles. So in Mandarin, at least in the way I grew up with in Malaysia, the language is saturated with ghosts, spirits, the afterlife. For example, there is a ghost festival where, in non-comprehensive terms, we believe that the relatives from the underworld are allowed out for a month and we have to feed them with human food or else they'll curse us. And since English is linked to the Enlightenment and also a relatively new language compared to Chinese or Hebrew, I wonder about the effect of language in discussing this topic of spiritual struggles and attribution, and even in the act of coining the term spiritual attributions, because we had no language for that before. And as someone who does offer Mandarin therapy, I wonder how using a different language also affects the level of spirituality in the therapeutic process. And also the language of emotion differs in meaning depending on the language. So if anger is linked to spiritual struggles in English, what would that mean for your native tongue or the tongue of your ancestors or your clients? Thank you.